Okay, I'm sure that many of you have quite a sleepless night waiting for the last two papers to be delivered after this yesterday. I'm very excited. So, and this is really our final session, and it's called Jewish Food Fights. So this is, and I'm happy to introduce the first presenter. It's Ari Ariel, and he's a lecturer in Middle Eastern history at Bryn College, and is the author of the Jewish-Muslim Relations and Migration from Yemen to Palestine in the late 19th and 20th century, and published this year, or it is this year, yeah, so great, congratulations. And his current study focuses on Middle Eastern Jewish foodways. His topic is Mosaic or melting pot, the transformation of Middle Eastern Jewish foodways in Israel. And everyone has 35 minutes, yes? 25 minutes, 25 minutes.
We'll see.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, you're now in charge.
Okay, so I'm talking about, up till now we've spoken a lot about, mostly about European Jews and American Jewry and their interactions with other communities. And today I'm going to be focused on Middle Eastern Jews and their interactions with European Jews, primarily in Israel. And I thought I'd begin with a story told by Yehiel Hebshush, you don't have to worry about his name too much, a merchant from a prominent family in Sana'a who immigrated to Israel in 1927, to Palestine in 1927. After the establishment of the state, he wanted to import two things from Yemen to Israel. Samna, which is a clarified butter, and wazif, which is a small dried fish. So he went to the Ministry of Industry to get permission, and he then had to go to the Rabbinate to get a certificate that these foods were kosher to be able to import them. And the Rabbinate rejected his request, saying these foods were unkosher or treif. And he was upset. So he was still intent on importing these things, and he first went to a local Yemenite rabbi in his community to try to get him to intercede with the Ashkenazi rabbis on his behalf. And that rabbi was a little bit afraid to interfere and refused. So in fact, in his memoir, he tells us he's not going to give us this guy's name because he doesn't want to insult him or put him down. And then he then turns to Shalom Yitzhak Halevi, who was the son of the last chief rabbi of Yemen. And Halevi at this point was already the chief Yemeni rabbi in Tel Aviv. So he's kind of calling in the big guns as he moves forward. The idea that the certificate had been rejected, or the request for the certificate, enraged Halevi. So he immediately calls the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv. The chief rabbi at the time is Rabbi Unterman, and he schedules a meeting, which we're told is full of, a room, quote, full of long-bearded, distinguished rabbis. All of them still reject giving this certificate to Hebshush, but Halevi is undeterred. He rises defiantly and says, quote, "If my father, the head of the community, and all my forefathers ate samna made by Arabs and fish wazif, my community and I will eat them and will always eat them. You must give Mr. Yehiel Hebshush the required certificate. If you forbid them only to yourselves and your community." So after a bit of debate, they concede and they give Halevi a certificate that these foods are kosher for his community only. And I should say the problem here is that these foods in Yemen were made by non-Jews, right? So they may not follow the laws of kashrut in making them. So I think two things are very clear from this. First, Yemeni Jews in Israel wanted to preserve their foodways, saw them as an inseparable part of their culture and tradition, and they clearly didn't understand migration out of Yemen and into Israel and the establishment of the state of Israel as a break with Yemen. And secondly, distinctions between ethnic communities in Israel were being drawn here using food, right? Food is clearly acting as a boundary marker, in this case between Yemeni Jews and other kinds of Jews. And I think those 2 points could be made pretty much for any Middle Eastern Jewish community in Israel. So in my time today, I'm going to use the Yemeni example to talk a little bit more about changes in Middle Eastern Jewish foodways after migration to Israel, how these ideas are related to the ideas of melting pot and multiculturalism, and then I'm going to kind of jump forward to the contemporary and talk about the role of Middle Eastern Jewish foodways in modern Israeli cuisine. But before that, I want to make sure that it's very clear who I'm talking about. And a few times I've taught undergraduate courses and realized towards the end that one student didn't know who I meant by Middle Eastern Jews. And this is probably confused by the fact that Israel is obviously in the Middle East. So I'm not talking about all Jews in Israel. I'm talking about Jews who either immigrated to Israel or whose ancestors immigrated to Israel from other parts of the Middle East. And around the 70s, they come to be called Mizrahim, or Eastern Jews, as a collective group, in contrast to those who immigrated from Europe, or Ashkenazi Jews. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Zionism, as you probably remember, is primarily a European movement initially. So on the whole, European Jews immigrate into Palestine and Israel earlier than Middle Eastern Jews. By 1948, there are around 700,000 Jews in Palestine, and around 90% of them are Ashkenazi. But there was also an important indigenous Jewish community in pretty much every part of the Middle East, or what we now call the Middle East, and by that I mean actually Middle East and North Africa. So I just thought I'd give you some idea. These are the numbers of these communities around 1948, and they're all largely, or a large portion of these populations is going to move to Israel, which I marked in a kind of corny way with that, that blue dot. So by and large, these Jews from these places migrate to Palestine later than European Jews, and they're by and large not motivated by ideology. But by 1948, the combined pressures of Arab nationalism and Zionism made their lives more difficult, and they were ready to migrate. And I just thought, I don't expect you to look at this, but what I expected you to get from this, hopefully, is that in the 2 decades after 1948, the vast majority of this population, the number would probably be a little closer to 1 million if I had included Turkey and Iran on this chart, leaves their countries of origin, right? So you have about 1 million people moving. From the mid-50s on, Middle Eastern Jews make up about half the population of Israel. And from then on, the tension between Middle Eastern Jews and European Jews would be one of the most important factors shaping Israeli society. In Israel, the mass influx of immigrants from both Europe and the Middle East doubled the population in the first 3 years after the establishment of the state. Israeli ideologues and politicians worried that the newcomers were not devoted adherents to Zionism. They would therefore have to be indoctrinated and assimilated into a new national culture. Borrowing the idea of melting pot from the American experience, Israeli politicians encouraged immigrants to shed their distinctive behaviors. In theory, this melting pot ideology should have applied to all immigrants, and to an extent it did. They would all have to take part in forming a new Hebrew society, and they'd have to shed their diasporic cultures and identities. But in practice, all Jews were not equal. Some would have to change more than others. European Jews largely controlled the state, and they viewed Middle Eastern Jews with the typical prejudiced and sort of Orientalist attitudes that were common at the time. Worse, they feared that if they didn't acculturate the Middle Eastern Jews into European culture, they themselves might be Orientalized. So Ben-Gurion spoke of fighting against the spirit of the Levant, and stressed he didn't want Israel to become like Morocco. And as late as 1969, Abba Eban would write about the cultural danger posed to Israel by the large number of Middle Eastern Jews. Quote, "Our object should be to infuse them with an Occidental spirit, rather than allow them to drag us into an unnatural Orientalism." End quote. So the melting pot process, for that reason, was experienced by Middle Eastern Jews largely as a kind of humiliating attempt to civilize them. In the words of Sami Shitrit, a Moroccan Jewish poet and activist, "When reasonable Ashkenazi people talk to me about integration or melting pot, or the integration of exiles or other national sugar-coated candy, I want to ask them in all seriousness, why are you troubled with the fact that I want to stay Mizrahi? Or what elements of my Mizrahi culture or identity do you wish to adopt or bestow to your children? In other words, what is left of Mizrahi identity after integration? Nothing." End quote. So these Orientalist attitudes towards Middle Eastern immigrants unsurprisingly extended to their foodways. The new immigrants had to be taught to eat appropriately, in accordance with hygiene and nutrition, pretty much like Rakefet was talking about yesterday, so that they could be assimilated fully into Israeli society. The use of some Middle Eastern foods were encouraged, particularly local vegetables, which were thought to be appropriate for the climate in Israel, but cooking techniques and spicing had to change and new ingredients introduced. So for example, one Ministry of Education official thought that Middle Eastern Jews tended to overdo the use of spice. To achieve this, the World International Zionist Organization and Israel's Ministry of Welfare sent instructors into transit camps that had been set up for the new immigrants to teach them to plan menus and to cook, particularly how to use widely available ingredients like cheese, milk, powdered eggs, and new and unfamiliar vegetables. And this, in fact, is true for Middle Eastern and European Jews, right? So like the eggplant may have been unfamiliar to some people and they need instruction for how to use it. The attempt to get immigrants to change how and what they ate was, of course, met with resistance. But studies done in the 50s and 60s suggest that Middle Eastern Jewish foodways did change, and they give two reasons primarily. One is that European Jews had a higher socioeconomic status, so Middle Eastern Jews wanted to emulate them to some extent. And secondly, because production and importation were controlled by Ashkenazi Jews who controlled the government largely, and they provided foods that European Jews most wanted. They also make some general observations about how foodways change. And I just thought I'd highlight three. Changes in foodways, this is unsurprising, are positively correlated with the length of time in Israel and intimacy with contact of people of other communities. Some meals change more readily than others, so breakfast changes the fastest. Shabbat and holiday meals are more resistant to change. And children, through their exposure to new foods, particularly at school, play an important role in this transformation. So according to one study, quote, not only does the child take his values from outside the culture of his parents, but he becomes in turn the agent through which the mother acquires the new culture. And these are probably universal. So I don't know, Krishnendra Ray notes the same thing for Bengali immigrants in the US, right? In the Israeli case, the state actively encouraged this, particularly the aspect of children taking part of this transformation. So for example, in the transit camps that were set up for new immigrants, families were separated, children and adults slept separately and dined separately, despite the fact that the parents protested, saying they had the right to decide what their children would eat. And this was done partially because of Ashkenazi stereotypes of Middle Eastern Jewish men, that they might take the best part of the food for themselves, they might spend money on arak or another kind of alcohol, so kind of common Oriental stereotypes. But another reason I think this was done, and I'd argue the main reason, was so that the children could be taught to eat properly, and then after they left the camps, could teach their parents these new table manners. In Yemen, people ate seated on the floor or on cushions. Food was served on straw plates or metal plates, either on a mat on the floor or on low tables. And worse still, from the perspective of health officials in Israel, in Yemen and other Middle Eastern countries, they ate with their hands. In Israel, Yemeni Jews would be expected to give up these primitive habits. Table manners, etiquette, and hygiene were part of the process of civilizing Middle Eastern Jews. And the use of a knife and fork in particular became a measure of modernity and progress. So, well, I guess you can't see that very well. So I have a couple of pictures to show you. This is from a book published in 1950 in both Hebrew and English. So the English is Exodus from Yemen, and in Hebrew the title is Yetziah Miteiman. And the book largely describes the immigration, and also within this immigration from Yemen to Israel, you see a transformation from kind of primitive Yemenis to cultured Israelis. And here, this is in fact the subtitle in the book itself. I didn't make this up. Knife, fork, and plate technologies enters their lives. So you see a nurse teaching them how to use a knife and fork. This is towards the beginning of the book. The last page of the book is a picture of a Yemeni family sitting at a table with a knife and fork, eating in a sort of more proper European fashion. So I think you get the idea of the kind of transformation the book is advocating. And here you'll see something kind of similar. This is from a movie made in 1952 by the United Israel Appeal. It's a fictional story about two girls who are trying to escape from their transit camp into a youth aliyah center. And again, the movie revolves around their transformation and they're becoming civilized, cultured Israelis. And in this short clip, you'll see a girl, Tamar, eating with a fork for the first time.
Fingers are cleverer than a fork, yet see how the fork defies them? I feel like a child learning how to walk. So,
I think you get the point. So that's one kind of change I want to talk about. There's this change made under the pressure of sort of civilizing agents of the state. Other changes occurred because traditional food products were hard to get in Israel, or expensive. So Iraqi Jews, for example, ate less mutton, rice, burghul, okra, and fresh fish after migration, despite the fact that all of those had been important foods and favored foods in the Iraqi diet. They substituted noodles and potato flour for rice, because during Israel's austerity period, meaning right after the state, there's a period where things after the state is established, there's a period where things are rationed. The amount of rice rationed per family was pretty small, so it would often be saved for special occasions. Across the board, for all Middle Eastern communities, there was an increase in the consumption of dairy and vegetables, a decrease in consumption of meat, particularly for the middle and upper classes. Margarine largely replaced samna, the clarified butter that we saw Hamshus trying to import earlier. Noodles replaced rice, white flour replaced wheat flour, and other kinds of grains that were used for making bread. Traditional breads were still made, particularly for holidays and Shabbat, but modifications had to be made to those. Also, I guess not very clear, this is a picture of kubane, which is a Shabbat yeast bread made particularly by Jews in Sana'a. And it was so important to their Shabbat celebration that according to a prominent Yemeni rabbi, Yosef Kafeh, if one didn't eat kubana on the Sabbath, it was, quote, as if he didn't observe Shabbat according to the halakha, meaning according to Jewish law. In Yemen, it was made with wheat flour and samna, the clarified butter again. In Israel, it was generally made with white flour and margarine, and often enriched with eggs and sugar. So you can also see kind of the flavor profile changing and things becoming sweeter and richer. Other changes occurred because cooking techniques previously used were impractical in Israel. In Yemen, cooking was largely done in earthen vessels in traditional wood ovens. And in Israel, this primus kerosene stove became the most common method of cooking. The picture on the far right, I wasn't sure if you'd know what a primus looked like. The picture on the far right is from one of the earlier cookbooks in Palestine, maybe even the first if I remember correctly. And you see a woman cooking in an aluminum pot over this stove. And that was really a very common method. So obviously the shift from cooking in a traditional earthenware pot in a wood oven to this method would have changed the flavors as well. So one Yemeni woman said of cooking, for example, quote, "It's easier here, but there the food was more tasty." In fact, in a 1958 survey of Yemeni and Iraqi housewives, a large majority, 82% of the Yemenites and 73% of the Iraqis, said they had trouble preparing their traditional foods in Israel. And almost all the respondents preferred the taste of their own foods to that of Western food. Which means if I think about this kind of in relationship to what Hasia said yesterday about pleasure and the importance of pleasure in Jewish food, the change in Middle Eastern cooking must have been accompanied by a loss of pleasure, right? So that perhaps is problematic. And Middle Eastern Jews were clearly not willing to give up those old flavors, especially not in exchange for Ashkenazi flavors. So to emphasize that, I have a clip from a movie called Casablanca. It's a Romeo and Juliet story about Middle Eastern Jews, a Middle Eastern Jewish man named Yosef, who's nicknamed Kaza because he's from Casablanca, and an Ashkenazi woman named Rahel. The film is made in 1974, so by that point, the idea of melting pot is probably losing favor. The idea of cultural homogeneity is perhaps falling out of flavor and being replaced slowly by multiculturalism. I think that's an important part of the way the film depicts intermarriage. But in this scene, Kaza is going to Rahel's house for the first time for Shabbat dinner and is served gefilte fish, which we will talk about more today, I take it. And you'll see that her parents are not thrilled with the fact that he's Moroccan and he doesn't love the gefilte fish so much. So maybe they're even. And you'll have to read subtitles, sorry.
שלא יהיה לך יותר מדי מתוק.
מה זה דק מתוק זה?
זה גפילטה פיש.
אצלכם במרוקו לא היה גפילטה פיש?
אבא, גפילטה פיש זה לא מאכל מזרחי. בתיאבון.
So I think you get the sense there that this interaction of flavors wasn't always positive, right? So Middle Eastern Jews then were clearly resistant to give up the flavors they were familiar with in exchange for Ashkenazi foods. And until now, I've talked about the pressure exerted on Middle Eastern Jews to assimilate and also the various ways that their food did change. But many foods, of course, resisted assimilation. And the thing that was most resistant to change was spices. Middle Eastern Jewish cooks insisted on using traditional spices and spice mixtures, maybe because they were easier to get or they would have been not all that uncommon from what was available in a Palestinian marketplace. But we do know that if unavailable, they would buy them on the black market, right? So these things were important to them. Also, condiments resisted change, and I thought I would give you a picture of two of them. Probably also a little too big. The first is, on the right, is hug, a green paste made of cilantro, garlic, and chilies, which is very popular with Yemeni Jews. And on the left, you see amba, which is a pickled mango chutney made by Iraqi Jews. And these continue to be used regularly, and maybe more importantly, have now entered the Israeli mainstream. And of course, there was a technical change here. So for example, in Yemen, the srug would have been made with a mortar and pestle, right? And now it's made largely with a food processor. So there is a slight change there as well, but these foods continue to be important. So any Israeli falafel stand will have them. And this picture is, in fact, from an Israeli restaurant in Toronto. So you can see, I guess my point here is that they're spreading from these small communities to Israel and then to a larger international setting. While all the early studies noted that Middle Eastern Jewish foodways were being westernized, they largely failed to notice that Ashkenazi Israelis began eating Middle Eastern foods. And this was a continuation of an earlier trend. Early European Jewish settlers in Palestine adopted Arab foodways and behaviors, both to mark themselves as local and because they believed Palestinians had preserved some aspects of biblical culture. So again, there's a bit of Orientalism built in here. Likewise, some early nutritional studies in Palestine recommending emulating Arab foodways as the most appropriate for the local climate and environment. Gradually then, during the first half of the 20th century, foods like falafel and hummus entered the diet of European Jewish immigrants in Palestine. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 amplified this process for two reasons. One, during this rationing period that I mentioned before, Israelis increasingly ate in Palestinian restaurants, partially because they wanted to circumvent the rationing system so they could buy meat more easily in Palestinian villages, but they also ate in these restaurants and became accustomed to these foods. And then with the wave of immigration of Jews from the Middle East, these Palestinian foods could be redefined as Middle Eastern in a more general sense, and therefore as part of the cultural inheritance of Middle Eastern Jewry. For their part, Middle Eastern Jews, so say immigrants would come from Syria or Lebanon, Jewish immigrants into Israel, and then hummus or falafel could be defined as Lebanese or Syrian Jewish, right, and de-Arabized in a particular way. For their part, Middle Eastern Jews adopted these foods on the part as part of their culinary repertoire, particularly on the menus of Oriental restaurants they were increasingly opening in the 50s, even when these dishes were not native to their countries of origin. So for example, hummus and falafel were not eaten in Yemen, but would appear in Yemeni restaurants, or there would be Yemeni falafel stands and things of that nature. Thereafter, hummus or falafel could be adopted as Jewish Oriental food, and eating it could function as an embodying practice which made Jewish immigrants from Europe local. For Middle Eastern Jews, two distinct processes were at work here. Specific ethnic cuisines were homogenized and defined. For example, a single Yemeni cuisine was only conceptualized after migration to Israel. In Yemen, village, city, or regional identities were more important than a general concept of Yemeniness. However, in Israel, as San'anis, people from Sana'a or Aden or Haban, came to see themselves first and foremost as Yemen, their distinct cuisines merged. Perhaps the best example of this is the elevation of jahnun, which I have a picture of, from a regional specialty to the paradigmatic Yemeni food in Israel. In Yemen, jahnun was a Shabbat dish, again a Sabbath dish, associated with southern villages, particularly around Ba'adan. And we know from memoirs and other records that people from the north of the country had never seen it before they got to Israel, sometimes in Aden on their en route to Israel, but it wasn't part of their local cuisine at all. Now it's the most well-known Yemeni food in Israel and is eaten by all Yemenis and also Israelis of other ethnic groups, particularly on Shabbat morning. It's mass-produced and sold frozen in almost all Israeli supermarkets. And the package you see there is actually an American package, so again, now it's being internationalized. So a single unified Yemeni cuisine was constructed and then entered the Israeli mainstream. Get rid of At the same time as Middle Eastern Jews opened more and more Oriental restaurants, Oriental in quote here, sorry, a pan-Middle Eastern cuisine emerged which included Palestinian Arab street foods and the culinary highlights of other Middle Eastern Jewish communities. So things like Sephardic burekas, Moroccan cigars, Iraqi sabih, all these kind of specific ethnic dishes from specific ethnic cuisines become universalized in Israel. At first in the Mizrahi community, and then for all Israelis. And despite all the pressure placed on the earlier immigrants to westernize their foodways, it's these foods that today form the basis of modern Israeli cuisine. In Israel, like in the US, Jewish food now means Ashkenazi food, while Israeli food is a hybrid Middle Eastern cuisine. Elements of Ashkenazi cuisine are present, but clearly play a secondary role. The promotional materials for a recent online course on new Israeli cuisine says this rather overtly. Referring disparagingly to Ashkenazi foods, it reads, "In the past 3 decades, Israeli cuisine has become one of the fastest changing kitchens. A melting pot of more than 60 different ethnicities from India through Morocco to Argentina has helped create a true synthesis of flavors. This is not your mother's matzo ball or chopped liver, but rather a sophisticated Mediterranean flavor that rests on local ingredients with international flavorings," end quote. And perhaps it's not coincidental that the last 3 decades being talked about here are the period during which multiculturalism replaces the melting pot. So more and more states have turned away from this idea of cultural homogeneity, and cultural diversity within a nation is now a sign of modernity and cosmopolitanism. For Israel to position itself as modern, it now needs a cuisine that's diverse and ethnic. Sometimes this hybrid makes for some strange foods. In the 1990s, an Israeli restaurant chain called Nargila, a Yemeni Israeli restaurant chain called Nargila, became famous for a dish called ziva, which I have a picture of on the bottom there. This dish was based on a popular Yemeni flatbread called mulawa, which is, in those 2 pictures, you see it comes frozen also in the supermarket, should you want it, which is similar to paratha or roti. But this ziva was folded in half and stuffed with cheese in a decidedly un-Yemeni fashion. It became a sort of Israeli-Yemeni calzone. Most customers, I fear, thought it was a traditional Yemeni food. So that's the sort of modern version stuffed with cheese on the right. Even the name of the restaurant speaks to its hybridity. Nargila is the Palestinian Arabic, not Yemeni word for a water pipe or hookah pipe. But maybe after the 2nd or 3rd generation in Israel, the distinction between Middle Eastern communities had become less important. Maybe all elements of Middle Eastern culture had become interchangeable and thus part of everybody's heritage. Today, this trend continues. Middle Eastern, Palestinian, and Ashkenazi foods are combined in ways that create a new national cuisine that could exist nowhere but Israel. Forced assimilation into Ashkenazi culture seems to have given way to a voluntary fusion of ethnicity, at least in culinary matters. This is true both in restaurants and in the private sphere. Food writer John Agur, for example, talking about the food served by Israeli families for the Jewish New Year, says, quote, "Ashkenazi gefilte fish happily coexists with Persian pomegranate stew and Moroccan salads," end quote. Gur is right, but note that this kind of culinary borrowing is taking place largely in Ashkenazi households. So to be flippant, I've yet to be served gefilte fish in a Yemeni or Moroccan dinner. Right? If this new Israeli cuisine represents the consolidation of an Israeli identity and the creation of a new Israeli Jew, this new Israeli is surprisingly Middle Eastern. Ben Gurion and Abba Ibn may be turning in their graves. Thank you.